Good afternoon. My name is Arezki Daoud, and I am the editor of the North Africa Journal, as well as the managing director of MEA Risk Assessment Service. I was asked by the Center for Strategic and International Studies to contribute to this event on the Maghreb with a discussion on how energy trends shape government policies, specifically on spending and on broad social and economic planning. And in this case, the focus will be specifically on the Maghreb, therefore excluding Egypt in this case. In this context, prices and the global trends of demand and production for energy certainly play a significant role in shaping economic and social policies for the countries of the region, whether they are producers or not. However, on the practical front, setting aside the discussions on production levels and price points, sometimes being almost an academic debate of sort, in the current environment of the Arab revolts, if there is one bigger influencer and a common denominator among these countries when it comes to spending and general economy, it is a lot less about global energy markets, but much, much more about managing social and political crises, almost at any cost. This is essentially when politicians' views and survival tend to outweigh the concern of economists. This is going to be the main narrative of my presentation, one that emphasizes greater spending to buy peace, almost regardless of what is happening in the energy market. For the professionals and economists of the region who are very different from the politicians but are tasked to report the news to their political bosses, when looking at the short and mid-term horizons, they see a mixed bag of good and bad news. Generally, though, from the perspective of oil-producing North Africans, the balance may be tilting towards the negative side. On the positive front is the broad feeling that the global economy is not on the brink of collapse. In fact, everyone's talking about a 2 to 3.5% global economic growth for 2014. That's certainly a positive sign, but there are far too many inhibitors in their outlook that are outside of their control, starting with the American push to become a tier 1 producer and exporter, coupled with the potential re-entry of Iran, the Iraqi wild card, and somewhat cooling off of the Chinese economy, etc. These inhibitors happen to have not only a direct negative impact, but the magnitude such impact could be maybe disastrous eventually. For those in non-oil producing countries of the region, any reduction in oil prices coupled with a more logical move towards a more balanced sources of energy supply helped somewhat deal with very difficult financial situations and poor economic performance they've been facing for many years now. In preparation for this discussion today, I conducted a brief poll of many of the region's energy officials over the past couple of days, and the consensus is that there is a strong likelihood that the barrel of oil, which averaged $109 in 2013, and that's specific to North African oil called Sahara Blend, could fall below $70, and for the most pessimistic views, it may even reach $50 by 2017. The first to blame is the U.S. Since 2008, when the shale gas phenomenon started in the U.S., each year production increased by about 1 million barrels, positioning the U.S. as the third biggest producer after Russia and Saudi Arabia. But they're also seeing sustained increases in volumes from other non-OPEC producers like Canada, Brazil, and even Sudan. All that may very well be sources of future trouble, but trouble is not unusual for the region, and obviously for oil-producing countries, internal politics is to blame for their economic performance, and not so much the movement of oil prices around the world and how changes in market leadership on the global scale may be affecting their own export performance. To illustrate what I mean by that, let's take a look at the performance of Libya first. 2013 has been a disaster for that country. Despite collecting a decent $40 billion in oil revenues in 2013, that was still 20% below projections, and that is certainly having implications on spending. Peak production of 1.6 million barrels dropped to 250,000 barrels in the second half of the year, bringing daily average to below a million versus a planned of more than 1.4 million. Things are getting better, with latest figures of over 500,000 in mid-January of 2014. But are they really getting better? Well, to start with, the country is spending more and generating substantially less revenue. 2013 is expected to show a near 2% budget deficit compared to the 32% budget surplus recorded in 2012. Despite denying it, the government has been dipping into financial reserves starting in the fourth quarter of 2013. So a mix of greater spending and lower oil revenues due to internal politics are causing substantial trouble for the Libyan economy. As we enter 2014, the political crisis in Libya is getting worse by the day. There is a variety of crises that the Zaidan government is unable to contain. Politically, the Islamist politicians have been waging a severe ideological fight against the relatively liberal National Forces Alliance. The political fight between these two is having a freezing impact on government and legislative affairs. Militias of all sorts have been cutting off electricity, oil, gas, and water to extract concessions from the government. In the northeast, the Amazigh Berbers have been expressing their political positions by blocking activity in pipelines and terminals. Two of the main provinces, the Fezzan in the south and Cyrenaica in the east, have declared autonomy. Some of their top political and military leaders, like Ibrahim Jathran and Ghaiti al-Ubaidi, have taken control of key oil facilities. These are men that have massive manpower to stop any central government offensive and even defeat it. Interestingly, Jathran has recently hired a law firm in North America to lobby U.S. and Canadian governments. These events are not related to the terrorism threat per se that we often hear about. They are not linked to the global oil market directly insofar as it is also about an internal political conflict. They are definitely about a nation that is looking for its soul and where the current political leadership is unable to control the situation. So when one looks at Libya's overall economic performance, one would think that austerity measures would be somewhat appropriate. Well, that's not really the case here, because social and political crisis containment is much more important for the government than economic logic. Although the 2014 budget has not been set yet, ongoing spending patterns indicate as to where Libya is headed. Some 42% of the 2013 budget was paid as salaries to 1.7 million public sector employees, with some 300,000 of such wages being phantom jobs. Think of folks getting more than one salary. On January 1st, 2014, state oil workers saw a 67% salary increase ordered by the government. Other government employees have been awarded a 20% salary increase as well. These are no austerity measures at all. Looking into Libya's spending patterns, and we can see that subsidies amounted to 10.6 billion Libyan dinars, or roughly 8.5 billion US dollars. That's about 16% of the total budget for 2013, which is arguably one of the highest as a proportion of GDP in the world. Gasoline at the pump, for instance, and as a reference point, is about 60 cents a gallon, the fifth cheapest gasoline in the world. And what makes the cost of petrol subsidy even higher is that without sufficient refineries output, Libya has to import its refined products. But the government, which is facing severe political and social crises, argues that if the Libyans were to pay normal prices, households will have to spend an additional average of $3,500 a year, which would make such a move a huge political risk. The proposed strategy for Libyan politicians has been to reform the law, substituting good goods subsidies for cash subsidies. So where is Libya headed? Well, we do expect the same, if not worse, regardless of such a subsidy reform. What about neighboring Algeria? Well, let's have a look at the country's budget to identify some key elements of its policy priorities. In 2014 budget is about $97 billion. It is based on a somewhat realistic barrel of oil averaging $90, which is, in truth, lower than what most forecasters predict. But the budget is looking at a less realistic GDP growth of 4.5%, an inflation rate of 3.5%. Inflation in 2013 was probably double that. Algeria is betting on an increase of 2.1% of oil exports. That should generate $57.4 billion, but that would be a huge challenge considering that 2013 export fell by 10%. That's a tough bet. Also, we see a budget deficit of more than $42 billion to be offset by a state compensation fund currently holding some $92 billion. Those are monies that are set aside when oil prices go over the budgeted average price. So why return to such a high budget deficit and greater spending? Obviously, there's great reluctance, even fear of upsetting the social balance in Algeria. The Algerian budget has no tax increases planned. Some $62 billion in local money is 4.7 trillion dinars will be spent on wages, notably creating hundreds of thousands of public sector jobs, including up to 20,000 police officer positions to be active in the volatile Saharan provinces. The money will also be used to fund the freezing of prices of commodities that the government ordered to keep social peace. Again, all this extra spending is happening at a time when there is less certainty about the strength of the oil market on the horizons. Algeria feels that it has the financial resources to control discontent, but it is all and exclusively being fueled by oil money. So what's ahead for Algeria? Well, more oil and more gas, and in the future shale gas, are seen as critical in paying for peace and also for reversing the declining trends of production and revenues. While no changes will occur in challenging the political status quo, all eyes are once again on oil and gas industries as the savior, if you will. The way Algerian politicians think is, when you lose in prices, you make it up in volume. The official approach here simply comprises of a 50% increase in production over the next 10 years, and increased investment up and down the hydrocarbon industry from transport to downstream. To 2016, a budget of about $80 billion has been set aside for all hydrocarbon-related activities. In 2013, some 550 million tons of oil equivalent were discovered from 32 new oil and gas fields, but production dropped to 1.1 million barrels per day. Algeria clearly needs to do more to fuel its social peace. This month of January, 31 plots, collectively the size of Germany, were made available by Algeria to foreign oil companies to help stabilize production. Some 135 square miles are up for sale. Algeria's bet is a really tough one, considering that the terrorist attack on In Amenas gas site earlier last year drove key oil companies away for a while. Regarding non-oil producing countries, let me speak briefly about Morocco first. In Morocco, efforts are clearly underway to try to distance the country from the impact of subsidies. Subsidies for petroleum have been unsustainable. The pie chart on the left shows that in 2012, oil products absorbed 90% of the $6.6 billion subsidy fund. The GDP then, as a reminder, was $97 billion. So we're talking about a 7% impact on the nation's total economic activity. This year, we're witnessing efforts to lessen subsidies through a gradual process of price increases. For the Islamist Prime Minister, It's a tough measure to take because he may be hurting many working and middle classes voters who have been accustomed to a populist narrative from the PJD Islamist Party. The impact is anywhere between 5.5 to 8% increase in gasoline prices at the pump simply because there is really no money to pay for it. In some sense, the government has no choice but to cut spending. The economic projections do not look too great. Economic growth, as you see on the top right chart, is expected to be just 2.4% this year versus 4.5% last year. Some economists say the impact of rising gasoline prices will mean a much lower economic growth as consumers and businesses will divert spending to energy. And tension is rising on the social front, where the population has been vocal in terms of showing discontent and over the increases. When you look at the latest state budget, it is indeed reflective of a tough position that Morocco finds itself financially, but also seeks to avoid social crisis by upping wages. You seemingly reduce subsidies on one hand, but you up wages on the other hand to compensate for that. In the budget, as seen on the bottom right chart, revenues are expected to fall by 6.7%, while spending is up 3% despite a 16 to 17% cut in public investments and subsidies. Yet there's also unwillingness to rein in wage trends. While subsidies will be down, wages will be up by 5.5%, or about the same level as the increase in gasoline price. The minimum wage, for instance, has increased by 77% from 2007 to 2013, and other wages have been adjusted upwards as hiring of state workers continues well into 2014 or this year. Now, a quick note on subsidies, which are a huge debate in Morocco. Although the fund's disbursement target, as proposed by the draft budget, was actually reduced from 40 million dirhams, or billion dirhams, sorry, in 2013 to 35 billion this year, 2014, the final budget for the so-called compensation fund is now set at 42 billion dirham because it needs another $7 billion dirhams to pay for its outstanding debt that the fund hasn't been able to pay for previous spending so far. So for those who need to tell a story based on their political positions, it is a sort of a glass that is neither or that is either full or half empty. Meanwhile, Morocco has been pushing for a greater energy diversification strategy. Renewables from solar, wind, and hydroelectrics are expected to account to or to surpass actually the 40% share of total supply. But Morocco has been very active luring independent oil companies, even some big ones looking for oil offshore. There has been a particular focus on solar energy ever since a consortium of German companies decided to focus on solar power with the Desertec project. Morocco, using its electrical connection with the Spanish power grid as a selling point, wants to generate some 2,000 megawatts of power by 2020 through 5 sites, bringing the share of solar power to 14% by then. But it is also investing in enabling home appliances powered with solar, specifically for the Moroccan market, with the biggest project being a water heater. To fund its solar projects, Morocco is leveraging its relationship with Gulf kingdoms. Saudi Arabia is donating $500 million. The UAE, or United Arab Emirates, about 300 million. The Moroccan Hassan II Fund for Social and Economic Development is contributing with some $200 million. That's about $1 billion so far. It's about 10% of what the country really needs to get its solar energy working or efficient, and there is still a lot of controversies, in particular with the location of 2 of the 5 sites, solar sites, being located in the Western Sahara, in disputed Western Sahara territory. However, all these efforts are eventually meant to reduce the country's reliance on petroleum. Finally, Tunisia has been somewhat much more proactive in controlling the impact of oil and gas on its broad economy. After all, subsidies for 2014 will account for 15% of the 28.3 billion dinars budget. This is still an enormous weight on the economy and the country's spending, and rightly so. Officials there do complain all the time about both subsidies and wages as being too big. Energy products for 2014 will account for 58% of the budgeted 4.24 billion Tunisian dinars subsidy fund, equivalent to 9% of the total nation's budget. For the Tunisians, subsidies are a big figure relative to GDP and represents 5% of it. But they have been making efforts, that is, the Tunisians have been making efforts to force changes. Prices there so far for gas and electricity are being sort of revised upward as part of the 2014 budget, an increase that is expected to save some $450 million. Not a bad number considering how dismal the Tunisian economy has been, in particular since the fall of the Ben Ali regime. Furthermore, in September 2013, the government decided or enacted a 50% reduction in its support to power-hungry companies. In conclusion, it is fair to say that the region is grappling with the potential of low enough oil prices as characterized by oil-producing countries, or too high as characterized by non-producing countries. The evolution of the global oil market and prices of energy is important, but social balance and domestic politics tend to outweigh regular economic logic when it comes to decision-making in those countries. Thirdly, social peace means that subsidies will not go away. Any reduction in subsidies will be compensated by higher wages, and that's been the response of governments there. What to expect? Well, same situation, eventually greater budget deficits for all countries, further dipping into currency reserves and greater financial imbalances for most, if not all countries. How to change this? Well, this is a political decision. None of the countries have the political capital to make substantial changes, and so expect business as usual in the coming couple of years. Finally, this last slide contains my contact information. If you have any particular questions or need to reach us, feel free to do so by calling us or sending us an email. Thank you.